Since time immemorial, people have wanted to know the ultimate nature of things. Not familiar with progress, and as is the case today more commonly, not satisfied with progress, by which I mean a continuous stream of better answers to better questions. They have sought finality instead, the ultimate solution to the mystery behind all mysteries, as it were. Of course, many of us think they haven't really thought things through. After all, were any of these final complete theories about the ultimate nature of reality shown to be true, that would be the end of progress, an end to improvement. It would be the end of seeking answers, the end of any need for creativity, and the end of learning more, because we would have the final answer. But our real circumstance is more optimistic than this, even though few seem to know it. Reality allows us to think bigger than supposed ultimate answers to everything. For example, it's possible to think that any purported ultimate answer to everything can itself be questioned, and when it is, actually reveal new questions to show it never was the ultimate answer to everything anyway. This is a far more exciting vision of reality than any single metaphysical dead end like God and heaven is behind it all, or it's all a dream and you're having it and you are all that exists, or it's all a simulation like a matrix, or it's all a simulation running inside a simulation, running inside a simulation, and so on. But if we think for a moment about all of those supposed answers to the mystery behind it all that I have just given you, none of them, when we really consider it, seem anything like a final answer anyway. And if we look more closely, not only don't they seem like final answers, they seem 2 steps backwards rather than any step forward. They all simply lead to more questions that are either more difficult to answer or, by the terms of the supposed answer, placed in a realm beyond which we can even inquire. We are told there is no point asking that question, or there is no answer. Here, Richard Feynman's quip, "I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned," seems to rear its head. If the solution you propose to some deep metaphysical problem is an answer that itself cannot be questioned because it lies not merely beyond science to answer but reason itself, then you have provided no solution at all. You've simply placed a roadblock in the way of progress. I should say, I must quibble with Feynman a little here. A question that cannot be answered is in truth also an answer that cannot be questioned. Both are ends to progress. A rational optimist is just someone who says all questions about reality can in principle be answered, if never quite in practice. None lead to questions that cannot be answered, or answers that cannot be questioned. A rational person asks if the explanation for why existence is something like God did it all, then we ask, where is God? Why doesn't this all-powerful God intervene when things go wrong? Or is it that God is actually evil, given evil, like the evil of natural disasters, is permitted? Or is God actually powerless to do anything about evil? The believer in God at this point tends to say these questions cannot be answered because God is a mystery beyond the capacity of our puny human minds to understand. At least his grand plan is, or something like that. So for those interested in explanations, we are at an impasse where we have made zero progress by invoking God to explain anything. That would be a classic God of the gaps kind of answer. Have a mystery? Well, that's God. A strange coincidence? God caused that. Or the simulation did. That's a recent refrain. And I do mean refrain. We're hearing it more and more from all kinds of prominent people. Even Joe Rogan recently, and I'll play you a clip later. And I will come to Scott Adams, who even more regularly invokes the simulation hypothesis. A person interested in explanations about the world and who wants to make progress in it wants to know why. They want to know why on the really big and deep questions. We want to know things like, why do the laws of physics have the form they do? How does evolution by natural selection produce species that are stable over vast periods of time? Or what is it about people that makes them conscious and creative? To answer any of these questions with God did it all, but how God did it will always remain mysterious to the living, tells us nothing except that there are some things we cannot know. If you are such a person, this is no sin unless, of course, you want to get in the way of those who want to improve on the current state of our knowledge. and insist certain questions not be asked, and thus certain answers not sought. As long as those who think progress cannot be made do not bar the way for those who think it can, no great harm is being done. Although it would be better if everyone agreed we could always make progress. Many hands make lighter work, and two heads are better than one, and so on for every cliche in the book about not simply giving up. But let's put God aside for now. What about those other supposed ultimate explanations of reality? Are they really that much different? Or do they all reduce to basically the same thing, an appeal to the supernatural? Like, perhaps I am dreaming, but if I am just dreaming reality into existence, where am I really? In another universe? What is that real universe like? And if I am dreaming, isn't that just the claim that all of physical reality exists, as science would claim, and it obeys physical laws, but with an added unnecessary assumption that none of this can be tested? Namely, I am dreaming all of it. That seems terribly unsophisticated. So what to do if you're a modern person with a penchant for grand ontological conspiracies? Well, here's one way to tweak that.
Here's one way to tweak the idea that you're just dreaming all of reality into existence.
A new thought experiment for a modern, scientifically minded, technologically adept civilization. It's not that we are dreaming all of reality into existence. What a childish fantasy that would be. No. All of physical reality is being simulated somewhere on a computer, somewhere, somehow. That's what's really happening. Okay, once more, for the person interested in explanations, we must immediately ask, after the same fashion, where is this simulation? In what universe? On what computer is it running? According to what laws of physics? If this is all a simulation running on a computer in the basement of a teenager somewhere, is that basement in a universe with physical laws the same as the ones physicists in our universe, the simulation, discover? Or are the real physical laws in the universe the teenager occupies unlike ours? If they're different to ours, then the laws that govern the computer are different to ours as well, and thus different things would be able to be computed by that computer compared to computers in our universe. What can be computed, after all, depends upon what the laws of physics permit to be computed. But if the laws of physics are the same in both universes, how did the boy in the basement come to know them with some sort of finality? Or did the programmer just make up some laws of physics that permitted the evolution of life and intelligence? Anyway, these questions are just for starters to show that the point is, these supposed answers like God, dreams, and the simulation are nothing of the sort. They are problems. Problems proposed to solve what exactly? What is the problem here in this world that demands we leap to a solution that just raises more questions, far harder to answer than those we already had? And worse, whose answers cannot ever be found by the rules of the thought experiment, because we are told in various ways some version of, you are just not permitted to ask them. Or if you do, there's no point in asking them because they cannot even in principle be answered. God is mysterious, we are told, and beyond our meagre minds to understand. So there's one nice, neat dead end, an answer that holds itself immune from criticism. Or we are told by the committed solipsist, no experiment can ever prove from within the dream that the dreamer is dreaming. You can't wake up, for that would be the end of reality, and of you also, because you are the dream. So if the dream ends, so do you. Or because at base this physical reality is just software, anything running within it must remain running on the computer which generates it. It makes no sense to think of the software escaping that computer in a disembodied way. It makes no sense to think of a computer game character leaping off the hard drive and into our world. What would it be made of? In there, it's just electricity representing bits. The computer game character is not made of atoms, but our world is. Well, on the simulation hypothesis, it's not. We are not made of real atoms. We cannot know what real atoms are like, if they exist even at all. They are outside the simulation and might obey different laws of physics if they do exist. And if they do that, in what sense could we be made of them? We, after all, obey different laws of physics, where things like carbon atoms have 6 electrons. Maybe there are no carbon atoms at all in the world outside our simulation. The bizarre thing about the simulation hypothesis in particular is that it is only postulated because we have learned something from science, mathematics and philosophy about the physical world. Namely, that these things called universal computers are possible. They're possible to build here in this universe. Upon learning this momentous thing, rather than seek more questions to answer in this world, someone to take that very useful fact about real reality, that we can build computers within it,
and apply it to some meta level,
where it becomes what all of physical reality is. They want to say, it's a computer. We're in a simulation, and that's that. And by the way, we cannot test this theory because we cannot get outside the simulation. Again, a dead end is appealed to when the really interesting questions that remain within the actual physical world are all unchanged and just as possible to answer as they were before this hypothesis was put. A hypothesis which is no more than an additional philosophical assumption. Everything we see and experience is a simulation running on a cosmic computer, possibly in the basement of a teenager in the real universe. Or is it the real universe? Perhaps that one is a simulation too. Ever since I realised there was actually a limit to what science can tell us, which is where good philosophy, epistemology and so forth steps in, I've been interested in these ultimate questions about the nature of reality. In large part, that's because all ultimate answers are only very superficially different and logically, in terms of their explanatory power, equivalent. They all beg the question in a technical, philosophical sense. In fact, I once wrote an essay for a competition run by a newspaper about exactly this. I didn't win, but I did get an honourable mention. It was called Begging the Big Ones, and it's up there on my website. Today, I might put things more simply still, and more in the style of David Deutsch, and say all of these ultimate answers to the nature of reality are appeals to the supernatural. They're all God, or equivalently God, or an all-powerful wizard, call it what you want. They are all explanations that cannot possibly be tested within this world because they are about the world beyond this one, which by definition we do not have access to. But if we had access to it, it would just be another part of this world and could be tested. Much like the way in which prior to around 1920, astronomers just
knew the universe was the Milky Way galaxy.
And everything was inside it. Only later did we learn some things, like the Andromeda Nebula, so called at the time, were actually other galaxies. We had access to them physically via their light, and so claims about them testable scientifically. By the way, historic note, people as far back as Immanuel Kant and even before thought that these nebulae could be systems of stars, other galaxies in other words, but they had nothing to go by but their guesses. Their telescopes and other astrophysical methods were woefully inadequate to actually test that hypothesis. So it was relegated to metaphysics. That's a trend in cosmology, of course, which is why science or physics has this totalitarian character to it. It absorbs everything from parts of philosophy like epistemology to even parts of metaphysics like cosmology. Perhaps there do exist other universes with different physical laws, and perhaps that is testable. But that's not like the simulation. It's another story. I've done a number of episodes on that, not least in my Max Tegmark Things That Make You Go series. See that right here. But the simulation hypothesis, whether it's the vanilla The Matrix kind, or Bostrom's nested simulations inside simulations of history kind, or God, or name your theory behind it all, they all have in common that they purport to answer the question of what the ultimate nature of this reality is that we occupy, only to propose a solution, putting us straight back at square one, where we ask, why are things the way they are? Namely, that way. Indeed, saying it puts us back at square one is too generous. It's square zero because the solution contains within it an assumption, which is now you cannot ask why things are that way because God is mysterious, or you can't get outside the simulation, or wake up from the dream, or whatever it is. All of these questions about the ultimate nature of reality sometimes go under the topic of ontology, but not always. People are idiosyncratic in their usage. People, and especially philosophers, use words differently. The words don't matter. My purpose here today is to take a deep dive on these matters about the ultimate nature of existence and whether the simulation hypothesis or hypotheses really are substantially different to all those other ones we have heard from time to time across the millennia as a civilization. I think one of the first times I heard about the possibility of how plain old realism might not be true was when I read Descartes' Meditations. Let's back up a bit. What is plain old realism? Realism just says that physical reality exists and science and other aspects to reason, like mathematics or philosophy and so on, can be used to uncover more and more about its nature by creating explanations. There's no boundary to reason, no limit, as we can always imagine alternative laws of physics or even alternative kinds of mathematics or logic. Now, there's one caveat here, namely, brains are made of physical stuff and physical stuff obeys laws of physics, so obviously we cannot imagine things that the laws of physics would prohibit us from imagining. By definition, I cannot imagine, and nor can you, what those things might be. But they do not include breaking the laws of physics. Obviously, we can imagine all kinds of violations of the laws of physics, like violating the conservation of energy law, or making perpetual motion machines, or getting to another galaxy instantly, according to a stationary observer. In any case, reason is the tool for finding answers that reveal more questions. Descartes' Meditations proposes the possibility that we could be being deliberately deceived by an all-powerful or almost all-powerful demon. Descartes believed in God. He had an argument for God's existence as well, but God, on his view, must also be all good, omnibenevolent, and so would not engage in the business of deceiving you, even though in some sense it was within his power to do so. In any case, Descartes' thought experiment required a demon for this reason, but we can ignore that bit. Descartes' basic point was more like, we make mistakes all the time. We dream from time to time, and so we can doubt the truth of just about anything. For example, in Descartes' case, he was sitting beside the fire, having had a little bit too much wine, and was drifting off to sleep and thought, am I dreaming now? And he reasoned, well, if I am, then I can doubt these hands I see really exist. They're dream hands. And if that's true, if I can doubt that, I can doubt the fire exists and the wine and even that I have a body. And so Descartes reasoned, perhaps it's all a dream and I can be certain of nothing about the real world. I cannot be certain of anything, it seems. Or can I? After all, if I am dreaming and doubting everything, then doubting exists. And I am doing the doubting, so I exist. I cannot doubt I am doubting when I am doubting. Or I cannot doubt I am thinking when I think, can I doubt I exist? Cogito ergo sum, so it runs in Latin. I think, therefore I am. Or in Descartes' formulation in the Meditations, he actually writes, I think I am as a necessary truth whenever it is thought. Now, I don't want to get hung up on that. I think Descartes was wrong, because if we concede he had a necessary truth in hand, then this requires it likewise necessarily has been expressed perfectly. That the representation of the thing, the necessary truth, and the thing itself are the same. So we cannot doubt the truth of the English sentence, I think I am, or the perfection of any of the words that label necessary and truth and think and am and all the parts and so on, or the fact that when it is uttered it may be false because the thinker winks out of existence and so on. Let's not get caught up in actually how Descartes is wrong here and should have gone just that one step further to being a thorough-going fallibilist. But on the topic of Descartes' demon, and we might be dreaming, being itself a denial of realism, we can say this is so because it claims that if it were true that something akin to Descartes' demon is deceiving you every moment, and you are merely dreaming, then objective physical reality is no longer able to be uncovered by the methods of science. Anytime you try to do science or anything else, you are just playing with figments of an imagination. And once more, for those interested in actual answers to problems, this seems like a dead end. If we are dreaming by a fire, then all the experiments we do in the world to test our theories are just tests of the dream world, not the real world. We don't have access to the real world. But again, and to paraphrase David Deutsch from The Fabric of Reality, taken seriously, this solipsist argument that only you exist and the world is something you dream just is realism, where science, history, mathematics, reason and all the rest work as they seem to do normally, but just with the added assumption, the added unnecessary assumption, that it's all a dream. And that unnecessary assumption that makes no progress on any actual problem should therefore rationally be jettisoned as worthless philosophical baggage. Worthless philosophical baggage is a great three-word paraphrase, not exact quote, from David that I think every reasonable person should carry around in their toolbox of rationality. Worthless philosophical baggage. I think when I was a teenager at school, I knew science could not answer every question. It took going to university to learn the misconception that science could indeed answer every question. In my case, that lasted about 1 year. Then I returned for different reasons to arguing science could not actually answer every question after all. But as a youngster, as in the case of most people, every older person almost, every religious person, priest and teacher I'd ever talked to about these matters replied with some version of God, heaven and the spirit world is beyond science or even reason, in a sense, to access, even if they didn't use those words exactly. So at least part of reality could not be uncovered, unless and until one died, so I was told, and continue to be told. But the living, here on earth, can never know what heaven or God is like. Of course, if they are wrong, the believers, and it's just nothingness after death, just literal, dreamless unconsciousness for eternity, you won't actually know God doesn't exist, because there won't be anything to know anything. You simply won't be, so you can't possibly know. Now, I'm not saying here and now that this is the case. I don't know what consciousness is, in what sense it exists, and so on. I don't know the relationship between it and human life. But we all know what it was like before we were conceived, don't we? It wasn't like anything. Or was it? Maybe we just can't remember. But if we cannot remember, on what media were all of those lost memories stored? Memories cannot just float free of matter according to our best understanding of science. But this goes beyond science, says the believer. Okay, so it may have just been naked experience not being recorded or remembered anywhere. Okay, that's another rabbit hole we'll avoid for now. Let me go over the same ground from another direction. Philosophically, Descartes' demon and the realm of God or the gods do not actually provide us anything by way of answers to make progress in the world we occupy. They propose a world we cannot access beyond this one. But this one we are in is the one rational people want to understand and make progress in, find answers about. Plato, as is often the case with these things, got there first by saying something similar 2,500 years ago with his cave analogy. And I've talked about this on Talkcast many times before. His argument was that we stand in relation to understanding reality, and we stand in relation to physical reality itself, as people chained in a cave do to the flickerings of shadows on the wall cast by puppeteers who walk behind them but are unable to ever see because they are chained, so their heads can never turn around to see outside the cave. Analogously, we cannot get outside our caves either, and our caves are our skulls. So Plato did have a deep insight there. Ultimate reality does exist, but we only get clues about it from scant and even misleading evidence. We just get shadows or flickerings of light. This gives us something true about realism. On the one hand, it suggests all we ever do is interpret limited evidence and can never access the ultimate nature of reality. But on the other, it casts a binary that doesn't exist. It says we can never make any progress towards understanding reality because we can only ever see the same fiction over and over again, cast on the wall of the cave. And the only possible means of progress would be to turn our heads and simply see ultimate final reality. But we cannot possibly do that by the terms of the thought experiment. So Plato was 2 steps forward, namely, we interpret scant evidence which often misleads us, and 1 step back. So we cannot make any progress towards actually understanding reality. But in truth, we can do the metaphorical equivalent of turning our heads in the cave. But that won't give us ultimate final reality. Instead, it gives us another set of problems. What then is the nature of all this stuff outside the proverbial cave now that we have escaped it and which was beyond our senses before? Now, here I'm thinking of things like inventing technology that takes us beyond our naked senses so we can see what was not seen before by using telescopes, microscopes, particle accelerators, and all the tools of the physical sciences. That's what turning one's head around in the cave is analogous to. So we can escape our caves. And in a sense, we do every time we make progress in science, mathematics, morality, philosophy, and so on, especially technology. At least we escape smaller caves for larger caves. We find solutions and widen our scope so we can see more. The universe, or physical reality, always gets larger as we learn more about it. In any case, Plato, as always, was a genius to notice something deeply true in philosophy, but he also promulgated a deep misconception. Namely, that we are closed to making certain kinds of progress because reality itself was not amenable to being understood, at least not by the typical person, for they are chained, restrained by the limitations of their senses. Again, these topics have been a mainstay of talkcasts for many years. Plato's cave, Descartes' demon, religious heaven, and the simulation. But as I keep promising, today I want to talk about the simulation in greater depth because of some peculiar, highly idiosyncratic takes on it I've seen recently. I used to think that people just proposed this simulation idea as a kind of philosophical curiosity. It's like the philosophical equivalent of a roller coaster. Nothing wrong with a roller coaster, they're fun. And this is what the simulation argument is like and how I treated it. Hence the Matrix trilogy of movies and all other science fiction in the same mould. They all assert that reality is not as it seems because technology is being used to trick us in some way. You watch, listen, or read the arguments for it, and you go on a ride, and it's even thrilling. The problem is, by the end, you're back where you started. You never made any progress. You just went around in a big metaphysical loop, and once you arrive back at the beginning, all the same questions arise. The most important of which is, well, what now? How do we make progress here in this world, whatever its ultimate nature is? Better we get back to doing actual science rather than metaphysical thought experiments, fun as they might be. So this is what I thought the simulation argument was all about. As I've mentioned, the first time I personally was aware of the simulation argument was in 1999 when The Matrix, the first movie in the trilogy, came out. It's truly excellent. It's by a couple of people called the Wachowski brothers. Well, at the time, that's what they were calling themselves. But I remember going there with friends of mine and being the irritating companion, whispering to them, "This is just Descartes' demon," or "it's brain in a vat," which was another common way philosophy lecturers and tutors would introduce this idea of solipsism, that you're the only real thing in this reality you occupy and everything else is a figment of your imagination because your brain is in a vat of chemicals connected to like some sort of computer. Anyways, I did think the first time I saw the Matrix movie that it was just like Plato's cave. There was nothing deeply original here, philosophically speaking. And I still think that. The Matrix is based on an idea that is millennia old with a slightly more exciting plot and cool characters engaged in some cool action. And of course, it has a technological spin and that makes it more fun and detailed. The premise is just that our whole universe is actually running on a big computer somewhere and our brains are plugged into the computer with a cable and we are unconscious and effectively dreaming the same dream as others who are all in the simulation. Something like that. The real world is not the world we see around us, it's something else. We're kind of asleep right now. And the main characters in the Matrix manage to unplug themselves. And when they do, they wake up in a dystopian future, in the real world, which of course has been taken over by evil artificial intelligence and robots and so on who are using human beings as a fuel supply, inexplicably. Anyways, the cave becomes a computer in simulation theory, or at least in what we might call the level 1 simulation theory. There is a real world, a single real world, but in the real world is a computer, or perhaps a series of computers. Anyway, it's a big supercomputer on which runs a simulation, and we are in that simulation. Okay. So we are brains in a vat. We need no eyes, ears, skin or anything, but rather cables can run straight to the visual and auditory cortexes, providing input the computer programmer wants us to experience. That's the level 1 simulation idea, or similar to the matrix idea. Now, the next level simulation idea that all the smart people like to talk about is Nick Bostrom's simulation theory, which is a bit of a spin on the original, a bit of a twist. The matrix with some spice, or the matrix within a matrix. By the way, if you watch the Matrix trilogy, there is this scene, and this is a spoiler alert, I think it's in the third movie, where the main character, Neo, who escapes the Matrix into the real world, is able to just use the power of his mind to psychically control some of the evil flying robots. Now, this is in the supposed real world. I genuinely thought at that point in the movie, okay, so the writers have gone for a Matrix inside of a Matrix twist. But it turned out it wasn't that. I thought that would be better. But no, Neo, the lead character, was just seemingly using supernatural psychic powers somehow to control these robots. It's not really explained. In any case, going to Nick Bostrom's version, Nick Bostrom seems to be motivated by the same set of impulses that Plato, Descartes, religious people, and the Wachowskis, who made the Matrix, were motivated by. The motivation is, what is this thing, ultimate reality? Can we reason our way to understanding something about it? Something final? Bostrom tries to use a mathematical or statistical or probabilistic argument to suggest we must, in all likelihood, be in a simulation. Well, sort of. It's not like there's any real mathematics to support his argument, to justify his argument, to explain his argument, which stand behind his argument. Bostrom claims to be trying to use a mathematical or statistical or probabilistic argument to suggest we must, in all likelihood, be in a simulation. And anyone else who explains Bostrom's argument always appeals to he's using statistics or probabilities or something like that. Well, sort of. In fact, you read the paper and the papers that Bostrom has produced on this, there's not any real mathematics there at all. It's all hand-waving. Here's how it goes. Bostrom writes in his famous original simulation paper, you can see that one on the screen here, he writes, quote, "This paper argues that at least one of the following propositions is true. 1. The human species is very likely to go extinct before reaching a post-human stage. 2. Any post-human civilization is extremely unlikely to run a significant number of simulations of their evolutionary history or variations thereof. Or 3, we are almost certainly living in a computer simulation." His conclusion, and this is clever in its subtleness, which is a hallmark of Bostrom's work, and that's not necessarily complimentary. I mean, subtlety here means one must think just that little bit harder about what it means, what he's just said, when it might have been said more simply and more plainly. Anyways, his conclusion to the whole paper is this, quote, "Unless we are now living in a simulation, our descendants will almost certainly never run an ancestor simulation." End quote. So the contrapositive of that is, or if you like, the logically equivalent statement is, and this I think is a more natural way for human beings to think, if we are running in a simulation already, then we will run an ancestor simulation. And that's how you get this fractal-like proliferation, according to Bostrom, of simulations inside simulations inside simulations and so on as time goes on. As time goes on, it becomes increasingly more likely that we are in a simulation. He in fact says that it might go from 98% certain we are in a simulation to, quote, 99%, 99.9%, 99.9999%, and so on. As one approaches the limiting case in which everybody is in a simulation, from which one can deductively infer that one is in a simulation oneself, it is plausible to require that the credence one assigns to being in a simulation gradually approach the limiting case of complete certainty in a matching manner. End quote. Well, appeals there to what is plausible. It's plausible. And complete certainty. Now, having heard that, you might think that it seems to be fair on the face of it. If it's simulations inside of simulations, then therefore it's more likely that you're in a simulation than not, because there's only one base reality. But here I must introduce David Deutsch's counter to this, as raised in The Beginning of Infinity, where he writes, and I've read this before, but let me do it again. David writes, Quote, "For an inkling of why it might not be, consider a thought experiment. Imagine that physicists discover that space is actually many-layered, like puff pastry. The number of layers varies from place to place, the layers split in some places, and their contents split with them. Every layer has identical contents though. Hence, although we do not feel it, instances of us split and merge as we move around. Suppose that in London, space has 1,000,000 layers, while in Oxford it only has one. I travel frequently between the two cities, and one day I wake up having forgotten which one I am in. It is dark. Should I bet that I am much more likely to be in London just because 1,000,000 times as many instances of me ever wake up in London as in Oxford? I think not. In that situation, it is clear that counting the number of instances of oneself is no guide to the probability one ought to use in decision making. We should be counting histories, not instances. In quantum theory, the laws of physics tell us how to count histories by measure. In the case of multiple simulations, I know of no good argument for any way of counting them. It is an open question, but I do not see why repeating the same simulation of me 1,000,000 times should in any sense make it more likely that I am a simulation rather than the original. What if one computer uses 1,000,000 times as many electrons as another to represent each bit of information in its memory? Am I more likely to be in the former computer than the latter? End quote. That's from page 454 or thereabouts from the beginning of Infinity. Okay, so that's one line of criticism. Bostrom presumes that by waving his philosophical hands that we can say 98% and then 99% and asymptotically get to as near as 100% as you like. Near certainty, we are in a simulation. But probability only works if we have a method of counting. We don't have a method of counting this simulations inside simulations inside simulations. Another way to put this is that on Bostrom's account, the chance you are not in a simulation is 1 in what exactly? How many simulations? There is one base reality. Are you in it? Again, the chance is 1 over the number of realities, most of which are simulations. This is almost like the question of asking, how many sides does a fractal have? Well, infinite, but it depends also on how much one magnifies it. A square's got 4 sides regardless, but a fractal either has infinite sides or the number of sides you choose to print out then count. By the way, a fractal is so called because it is not a one-dimensional object like a line, or a two-dimensional object like a square, but rather a 1-point-something dimension object. It has fractional dimensions. It's a fractal. That's where the word fractal comes from, which is sort of a way of viewing Bostrom's simulation, because the deeper you look into any simulated world, you see that it contains computers that run simulations of a world that can run simulations. But if simulations of the past, and this is what Bostrom is talking about, are being run simultaneously, and so there are extremely many of you, maybe infinitely many of you, all experiencing the same thing, do they really count as different versions of you? Base reality is running a simulation of you in the year 2025, but so is the simulation inside that simulation. And then for trillions upon trillions of simulations deep, they're all running you, your conscious self. Is that a trillion yous or one you if the qualia or experience is exactly the same? I mean, as we've said before here, given plain old quantum theory, never mind the simulation hypothesis, we already know as a matter of physics that fungible instances of you exist. Perhaps infinitely many of them. And perhaps they're all, well, they must be, all experiencing the same thing, which is one experience, not many experiences, even if there are multiple copies of you. But that really is plain old vanilla science. And we're talking about the simulation hypothesis stuff here now. And to go into whether or not simulations inside simulations where the instances of you are experiencing the same thing or not inside the simulation, well, I run the risk of boring myself to death as well as you, because we're getting away from what we can know in science into a realm where we are denied the possibility of actually knowing. And I don't like that. We can't understand why or how or what the nature of personhood would be inside of that simulation. Whereas in quantum theory, it's more interesting to talk about the relationship between personal identity and what's going on with the physics, because there's a possibility of actually getting to an answer there. With the simulation hypothesis, it's all just fantasy. So we can't possibly get to actually understanding answers to any of those questions. It's closed to us. Just to tidy up some loose ends with Bostrom. He argues that if we're not in a simulation already, if we are in the base physical reality of actual atoms and photons and space-time and cats, carrots and carnations, he says we'll likely go extinct before we can run any simulations because it's so unlikely we'd ever be the first, because there's only one first and the probability we're it is 1 over a number so large, perhaps infinity, it cannot be known. Or as David Deutsch has just explained to us, cannot be counted, not because it's uncountable in a technical mathematical sense, but rather because there's no known method of counting such things. So how can you do probability or so-called statistics on these things when you don't know how to count things? That's the whole point of statistics. Counting, or, then again, Bostrom says, if we're not already in base reality, and if we don't go extinct, we'll choose perhaps not to run any simulations of our past, by which we mean perfect or near perfect simulations with conscious beings inside. Now, that second one, if it becomes possible for us to run simulations of super high fidelity that have got conscious creatures inside, it seems it would be the moral thing to do, not to run the simulation, given the risks. David Deutsch has observed before that for an advanced civilization to run simulations of worlds containing conscious creatures who can suffer, or there's a chance they will suffer, and where there is lots of suffering in the world that they occupy,
It would be terribly immoral. And it would be.
I mean, effectively in this thought experiment of Bostrom's, one would have the choice to be a god of a kind, the simulator, and solve the problem of theodicity, which is the technical name for the age-old problem of, well, if God can do something about all the suffering and evil in the world, but doesn't, then this means he himself must be evil. Or if he cannot do anything about the suffering that exists, then he is not really worthy of worship and awe, and he is certainly not omnipotent. This, by the way, will be what Scott Adams says about the simulator, that basically they are like God, but they're not omnipotent or they're not all good. Because if you have the power to bring into being people in a world you do have some control over, then you can prevent the tsunami from drowning all those innocent children slowly. But if you choose not to, then you're evil. Presumably, if we can do this in the future, we'd have laws against it. But also, we'd be morally more mature and people would look at doing something like that in the same way we look at child abuse now, with absolute horror, and increasingly so over time. By the way, whenever I do a deep dive on anything by Bostrom, I'm always struck by the blasé way in which he has these throwaway lines in his writing that no referee apparently picks up or objects to, and which I guess he assumes the reader would never question because at first glance it seems uncontroversial, or perhaps he just thinks that his readers are philosophically minded rather than technically minded, or certainly don't have an understanding of the physics. In the present paper here
Is one such instance.
Bostrom writes, quote, "At our current stage of technological development, we have neither sufficiently powerful hardware nor the requisite software to create conscious minds in computers," end quote. How does he know the first part of that? It's true, we do not have the software because a conscious mind is software. It's some kind of program. We don't know what it is, but there must be some code to run. But as to hardware, what makes Bostrom think that we do not yet have sufficiently powerful hardware for that? Why are there no caveats about that claim, or notes, or anything?
What is the argument for it?
It's just an assertion. And I'd have thought in refereed papers like this,
Rank assertions like that one?
would need at least some explanation.
Even a bad explanation.
Anyways, my point is, until we know what the software is, we cannot make that claim. Maybe we only need a processor that runs at 1 megahertz, and we only need 100 kilobytes of RAM and a hard drive of no more than 20 gigabytes. I don't know, but we can imagine that is so. But this is par for the course for Bostrom's writing. Go to my review of his book, Superintelligence, for more, which was and remains lauded as a deeply important philosophical tome by some of the world's greatest philosophers. And yet it was the philosophy and science which I found truly wanting. I agree it's important for people to read these days right now. It's important to read if they're interested in AI and AGI because it truly is the motivating set of ideas behind most expert pronouncements on this topic. You can't underestimate its influence. It was read by the so-called smarter scientists and podcasters who then simply educated through interviews, TED Talks, and all the modern means of mass communication an entire generation of coders, tech experts, and especially those directly involved in AI. But most of them won't realise that that's what they've heard from voices they respect who are interested in this field. What they've heard has largely all been drawn from that one book because it was, well, A, the very first, and B, by a philosopher with few peers. He's so highly respected among scientists and other smart people. In other words, when people, especially scientists and others who like to dismiss philosophy as a pointless discipline because they're hard-nosed scientific rationalists, those same people will indeed point to the work of Nick Bostrom as interesting and important because he has this way of framing things in scientific jargon with a technological spin. And superintelligence is, par excellence, an example of that. Philosophy, I've got no time for that, many will say. Oh, but this work, superintelligence, it's absolute genius. Okay, so that's Bostrom for now. I will mention him again, of course, but for now I want to move on to the latest spin on the simulation hypothesis I have heard. So I'll end this part one here now, having gotten the theoretical basis, the philosophical ideas behind us, and move on to, in the next part, the more practical kind of ways in which people think they can use this theoretical underpinnings to actually make day-to-day decisions in their own life and to use it as a kind of self-help thing. And this is new. So next episode we'll go through that.